Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really interesting power struggle happening right now in tech.
Yeah, it's all about AI chips.
Mm.
Specifically, Huawei is making a serious push against Nvidia, which has, dominated for so long.
Exactly. And our mission today really is to figure out just how real this challenge is. Can Huawei actually compete with Nvidia head to head?
We'll be looking at the chips themselves, the hardware, definitely, but maybe even more critical is the software side of things. And of course, the whole geopolitical situation hanging over it.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. We've gathered quite a mix of sources to help us get a handle on it. Stuff from China Talk, Digitimes Asia, Tech with Machiri, Unite.ai, Tom's Hardware.
A-Invest, TRT Global, TrendForce 2, and even a video from Revo Now. So a good range from deep industry takes to what developers are actually experiencing.
Okay, let's dive right in. First off, Nvidia. How did they get such a tight grip on this market?
Well, it's not just one thing. People talk about their three-headed hydra. You've got the leading hardware, obviously. Then there's their networking tech, which is super important for big AI systems.
And the third head, that's the software, right? CUDA.
Bingo. CUD is the linchpin. It's NVIDIA's own programming framework, and it's incredibly powerful for getting AI tasks to run efficiently on their GPUs.
So it's like a special language just for Nvidia chips?
Sort of, yeah. But it's more than that. It comes bundled with huge libraries like CUDA, packed with optimized functions for deep learning. Think of it like getting a toolkit full of super efficient AI building blocks.
Ah, so it makes developers' lives much easier and gets more performance out of the hardware.
Precisely. And it plugs right into things like PyTorch, which everyone uses. That tight integration is key.
And the crucial bit CUDA only works on Nvidia hardware, right?
Exactly. That's the moat everyone talks about.
Oh.
It creates this incredibly sticky ecosystem. Performance is great. Everyone uses it. Why switch?
It sounds like a brilliant long-term play. This wasn't something they just cooked up recently.
Not at all. CUDA goes way back to 2007. Initially, it was for general computing on GPUs, not just graphics. NVIDIA was smart. They gave it away, built a community, helped people port their code.
Wow, 2007.
Yeah. And then in 2012, the famous AlexNet model being trained on CEA, that was a huge moment. Really proved its worth for deep learning.
So years and years of building this advantage, it must be a real pain for developers to even think about leaving that ecosystem.
Oh, absolutely. Those switching costs are real. You might have to rewrite tons of code. You lose access to those optimized NVIDIA libraries.
And the community support too, I bet.
Exactly. The CUDA forums are vast. If you have a problem, chances are someone else has solved it. Moving away means leaving that behind. Even if you're using Python and PyTorch, often CEA is still working its magic underneath.
Okay, so NVIDIA is sitting pretty comfortably with this CUDA advantage. How on earth is Huawei planning to compete with that? What's their strategy?
It looks like a three-pronged approach, really. They're trying to build their own equivalent, integrate with existing tools, and find ways around the lock-in.
Okay, prong one.
Build their own complete software stack. They have their own parallel programming model, CNN, and tools like MindSpore, basically trying to replicate the NVIDIA software advantage.
Their own CUDA and PyTorch, essentially. Got it. Prong two.
Deepen their integration with PyTorch. They know everyone uses PyTorch, so they're building adapters, like this torch and poo thing.
NPU for their neural processing units, I guess.
Right. The idea is to make their Ascend chips almost a drop-in replacement for NVIDIA if you're using PyTorch. They even became a premier member of the PyTorch Foundation recently. Big move.
Interesting. And the third prong?
Investing heavily in ONNX. That's the Open Neural Network Exchange.
Yeah, I've heard of that. It's like a universal translator for AI models.
Exactly. Like a PDF for AI models is a good way to put it. The idea is you can train a model somewhere else, export it to ONNX, and then run it on Huawei's Ascend chips.
Okay, let's zoom in on that first prong, Huawei's own software, CNN and MindSpore. How's that going? Are they catching on?
Well, CANN is their CDA competitor, been around since at least 2019. MindSpore is their PyTorch equivalent. They keep releasing new versions, like CNN 8.0 recently.
But is it easy to use? What are developers saying?
That seems to be the sticking point. Reports suggest significant usability issues. People complain it's unstable, hard to find help online when things go wrong.
So not like the huge CUDA community support.
Not really, no. Developers said they often end up needing direct help from Huawei engineers just to debug basic stuff. That's a major bottleneck compared to finding answers quickly on NVIDIA's forums.
That lack of a strong community must really slow things down.
It seems to. The public developer forums for Ascend just don't have the same buzz, fewer discussions, less public troubleshooting happening. One person called the initial setup quite overwhelming. The docs are there, apparently, but navigating them and finding solutions isn't always straightforward.
And what about just taking an existing AI model and running it on Huawei gear? Simple.
Doesn't sound like it, unfortunately. Reports call adapting models onerous. It often needs deep optimization work, sometimes directly by Huawei's own teams.
Which is totally different from the NVIDIA experience, where things often just work out of the box, right?
Yeah, Semi-Analysis described NVIDIA's out-of-the-box performance as amazing. It's a stark contrast.
But it sounds like Huawei knows this is a problem. You mentioned they're putting engineers on site with customers.
They are, echoing NVIDIA's early CUDA strategy, actually. They're embedding engineers at places like Baidu, iFlightTech, Tencent to help them migrate code from CUDA to CANN and optimize it.
Okay, so hands-on help to bridge the gap. Despite the software headaches, is there any sign the hardware itself is performing okay?
Yes, definitely some positive signs there. DeepSeek engineers, for instance, report getting maybe up to 60% of an NVIDIA H100's inference performance out of the Ascend 910C.
Inference, so running the trained model, not training it?
Correct. And they think more CAN software optimization could close that gap further. There's even this interesting idea floating around about using AI itself to optimize Huawei's software stack, kind of like that Sakana AI CUDA engineer concept.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift to that second strategy, getting cozy with PyTorch. Why is PyTorch integration such a big focus for them?
Because PyTorch is huge. It's like the dominant framework for AI research and used everywhere in industry. If Huawei wants broad adoption, their chips have to play nicely with PyTorch.
It's not just about making it run, though, is it? It has to run well.
Exactly. Developers shouldn't feel like they're taking a big performance hit or running into constant bugs compared to using NVIDIA. That's the challenge.
And their solution is this TorchPoo adapter. How does it actually work?
Yeah, TorchPoo acts as the bridge between PyTorch and Huawei's NPU drivers and the CANN backend. They talked it up at a PyTorch meetup in Shanghai last year. But the tricky part is that TorchPoo isn't part of the main PyTorch code.
It lives separately? Why does that matter?
It uses something called Private Use 1. Because it's separate, when the main PyTorch code gets updated, those changes aren't automatically tested against Huawei's hardware support. So you could get, unexpected stability problems.
Ah, okay. So developers might run into issues there. What's the feedback been like?
Mixed, I'd say. Progress is being made, but there are still reports of challenges with runtime reliability, documentation quality, things like compatibility across different PyTorch versions, getting third-party extensions to work, test coverage gaps. There was a huge thread on Zihu about it, showing a lot of community focus on these problems.
Still, are there reasons to think they can overcome these PyTorch integration issues?
Yeah, definitely some optimism. When Huawei became a premier member, the PyTorch Foundation itself said it would help bring PyTorch to more hardware, which sounds encouraging.
And they got a seat on the governing board too, right?
They did. That gives them more influence over PyTorch's direction. Plus, Huawei keeps emphasizing their commitment to open source in their official reports, specifically mentioning PyTorch. So the will seems to be there.
All right, let's look at that third piece, ONNX for model portability. Remind us what ONNX does again.
Right. ONNX is that open standard format, the PDF for AI models. It lets you move models between different frameworks and, crucially, different hardware.
So you could train on PyTorch with NVIDIA.
Export it as an ONNX file, and then potentially run that exact model on a Huawei Ascend chip using an ONNX runtime engine. It's about interoperability.
And Huawei's backing this.
Very much so. They support the standard ONNX runtime and even have their own version on GitHub, the Ascend ONNX runtime, with optimization specifically for CAN and their chips.
So their goal is to decouple training from deployment. Let people train anywhere, but deploy on Ascend.
That seems to be a key part of the strategy, yeah. Train on whatever you have access to, maybe NVIDIA, then export to ONNX and use Ascend for inference without a massive code rewrite, especially relevant in China, given the sanctions.
Makes sense. Are there any catches with ONNX? Is it foolproof?
Not entirely. Like any standard, it's not perfect. You can run into bugs, compatibility quirks. Sometimes specific AI operations don't translate perfectly and need custom fixes for certain hardware.
But it gives them a path, right? A way to be relevant even if training stays largely on CUDA.
Absolutely. It's a crucial pathway for inference, letting them tap into models trained elsewhere.
Okay, let's switch fully to the hardware now. How is Huawei actually doing with producing these Ascend chips, and how good are they compared to NVIDIA?
Well, there are reports, like from Digitimes Asia, that the Ascend 910C chip has hit a 40% manufacturing yield. That's apparently good enough to be profitable.
Still aiming higher, though.
Yeah, the target is 60%, which is more the industry standard.
Okay.
And their production plans for 2025 are pretty ambitious, aiming for 100,000 of these 910C chips and 300,000 of the slightly older 910B.
That's a lot of chips.
It is. It makes Huawei a huge player in China's domestic AI chip scene, potentially over 75% of production. They had to shift manufacturing to SMEC in China because of the U.S. sanctions, remember?
Right. And performance-wise, how does that 910C stack up? We mentioned 60% of H100 inference earlier.
Around there, yeah. So it's definitely behind Nvidia's latest Blackwell chips, but it's a viable option, especially for Chinese companies cut off from the top-tier Nvidia stuff. We're seeing companies like DeepSeek use it for inference, even if they trained on H100s. It shows that move towards using domestic chips where possible.
And they're working on newer stuff, too?
Oh, yeah. The Ascend 920C is in development, aiming squarely at Nvidia's Blackwell B200, so they're not standing still.
Can you give us a few key specs on the 910OC? What's under the hood?
Sure. It offers up to 320 TFLOPs and FP16 math, which is a common AI format, and uses around 310 watts. It also supports that fast HBM2E memory.
320 TFLOPs. How does that compare?
Interestingly, that's roughly in the same league as NVIDIA's older A100 chip for FP16, but maybe a bit more power efficient. Huawei's also reportedly pricing it aggressively.
And they're getting traction in China.
Seems like it. They've seeded prototypes to all the big players: ByteDance, Baidu, China Mobile, and apparently Ascend chips were used to train almost half of China's biggest large language models last year. That's significant.
Wow. I also read about this huge Huawei cluster. The CloudMatrix 384 sounds like a beast.
It is. 384 of those Ascend 910EC chips linked together with a super fast optical network. It puts out massive compute numbers, even beating NVIDIA's GB200 system on some raw specs like BF16 compute and memory bandwidth.
But there's a catch, right?
Yeah, the big catch is power consumption. It uses way more electricity than the NVIDIA equivalent, something like 559 kilowatts versus 145 kilowatts for the GB200. So performance per watt isn't nearly as good.
So powerful, but power hungry. And expensive, too, I heard.
That's the report, yeah. The overall CloudMatrix system costs significantly more than NVIDIA's GB200 NVL72 setup. The 91010C chip itself has a complex dual chiplet design, uses that HBM2E memory. Getting all that made, especially with sanctions limiting access to TSMC and forcing workarounds for memory, adds complexity and cost.
Though on inference performance, some say the 910C is actually pretty close to NVIDIA's H20 chip.
Yeah, reports suggest it's maybe around 95% of the H20's inference speed. So for just running models, it's quite competitive with the NVIDIA chips currently allowed into China.
Which brings us squarely to the geopolitical angle. These U.S. sanctions seem to be a double-edged sword.
Definitely. On one hand, they hurt Huawei's access to cutting-edge manufacturing and some components. On the other, by blocking Chinese firms from buying NVIDIA's best chips, first the H100, now even the H20, they're basically creating a protected market for Huawei inside China.
NVIDIA must be feeling that.
They've said as much. NVIDIA actually lists Huawei as a competitor now in their filings, acknowledging the threat. Some analysts, like Dylan Patel at SemiAnalysis, have called the U.S. export controls very short-sighted, precisely because they might just accelerate China's own chip industry.
And Huawei's not slowing down their ambitions. They're aiming high with future chips.
Right. They reportedly want their next chip, the Ascend 910D, to actually beat NVIDIA's H100. Samples are expected relatively soon, maybe late May 2025.
Wow. That could really shake things up if they pull it off.
It could. There's talk of China building this self-supporting AI ecosystem, which, would be a major challenge to U.S. tech leadership in the long run.
Even Jensen Huang at NVIDIA seems wary.
Yeah, he called Huawei the single most formidable tech company in China. It wasn't exactly complimentary about how the U.S. sanctions were handled, calling the effort poorly done.
Because it could backfire and push China toward self-reliance faster.
That seems to be the concern. If Chinese tech giants fully switch to domestic suppliers like Huawei, that's a huge chunk of revenue NVIDIA loses out on. And you have to remember, China's push for domestic chips isn't new. It's been a national goal for years, long before these specific sanctions.
We're already seeing practical examples, like that DeepSeek machine using Ascend chips.
Exactly. TrendForce reported on their all-in-one machine using Ascend 910B or C chips. Apparently offers maybe 60–70% of H100 performance, but at a much lower cost. That's a compelling proposition in the current environment.
Okay, this has been incredibly insightful. A really complex battle on multiple fronts. If you had to boil it down, what are the main takeaways?
I think the main thing is that Huawei's challenge is absolutely serious, especially within China. They're hitting it from all sides, improving their hardware, building their own software stack with CANN and MindSpore, but also cleverly integrating with PyTorch and using ONNX to get around the CUD mode.
And the sanctions are paradoxically helping them gain traction domestically.
Right. Nvidia still has a massive advantage with the mature CUDA ecosystem, no question. But Huawei's progress is undeniable. Driven by their own R&D and these geopolitical forces, they are a real growing competitor.
So, to leave our listeners with something to think about, given how fast AI is moving and how vital these chips are, how might this power balance shift in, say, the next few years?
Yeah, what could the ripple effects be for tech globally? And maybe, what's the one factor we haven't talked much about, some hidden element that could ultimately decide who wins this incredibly high-stakes race? Something to chew on.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for tuning into this deep dive.